I did not want to miss this opportunity to be an ambassador for the National Park Services and for the Gullah Geechee Corridor Commission. In fact, our executive director this evening is in Rwanda. And so she is in Rwanda doing work to gather, to think about the ethnic enclaves of Rwanda and how that fixes or how that matches up with Gullah Geechee culture in the US. You've heard a little bit about my accomplishments. I want to share with you that I am also an African American Studies scholar. Like, my area of expertise, I have a master's in African American Studies from Clark Atlanta University. And your university, University of North Carolina, Wilmington, has just inaugurated a class on Gullah Geechee culture. So we now have an actual class that fit in the line of Harvard and in the line of College of Charleston and Coastal Carolina, that has just been inaugurated with our first class last year. And we are getting ready for the school year, y'all, and it is a lot of work. I bring resources to you about Gullah culture. You will hear it said from the Carolinas up. You will hear most people use Gullah. They'll say Gullah culture, Gullah people, Gullah language. When you hit Georgia, though, the language there is Geechee. Now, I know everybody wants to Frenchen it up, like they want to turn it into French. So I've heard, like, my colleagues say, Geechee. It's not Geechee, it's Geechee. It's Gullah Geechee. So I want to share with you a little bit about, in the time that we have tonight, just a little bit about Gullah Geechee culture. I have 12 slides, but I promise I will not drag you through all 12 slides, but I will try to be in conversation with you this evening. So I guess where I would like to start is in the color indigo. I'd like to remind you tonight, I intentionally wore a shade of blue. Now, I love Duke blue. Now, some of you probably don't like Duke blue, you Chapel Hill blue fans, and that's fine. Tar Heel blue is fine. But the color blue actually has a resident history, both in African-American culture, but also in the region. In fact, the color was indigo. The color was indigo, y'all. And indigo was this rich color that's a cross between like a European cadet blue, but a little bit lighter because of the Carolina sun. And so this indigo dye was created by African-American hands who were once West Africans brought over from the coastal West Africa to create what we now know as Gullah Geechee culture, not Gullah Geechee, not just Gullah, not just Geechee, but Gullah Geechee culture. And so indigo is an important color, not only because it is a culture of spirituality in Gullah Geechee practices and tradition, but because it was African hands who created the dye, that created the blue, that created this culture that is rich to our native land, rich in history to our world. So let me just take you a little further. The saying in Gullah culture goes, if Una ain't know where Una going, then Una should know where Una come from. It's very simple. It's really kind of what we might call Sankofa. And Sankofa is a word that means in West African culture, you need to go back and fetch it, which means that we want to tell you this evening that you have a responsibility. We all have a responsibility. Whether we're Binya or Kamya, we ought to go back and fetch our histories. The ones that are easy to tell, but also the ones that are difficult, also the ones that are beautiful, also the ones that are steeped in blue. So if Una just means you, and know where Una going, that is probably sounds very close to a Jamaican patois to you. It means that if you don't know where you're going, you ought to know where you came from. So we want to tell the history of where Gullah Geechee folk come from. Where them peoples come from, you say? Well, African folk along the Senegambia, Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast, and Benin had a particular ability to cultivate rice. They were already cultivating shrimp and rice in this landscape and in this milieu. And what you probably already know about the Carolinas, which is one of the things that I love about being a South Carolinian by birth, but a North Carolinian by living, is that I get to spend time in a region that made its wealth off of rice. As you might know, Barbados is famous for its sugarcane plantations. Those plantations, owners had first sons, and those first sons inherited those plantations, but the second sons did not inherit those plantations. In fact, we know that second and third sons often went off to either military or they went off into religious spaces. But these are entrepreneurial sons trying to break away from European controls and constraints. And so what they decided to do was to take themselves into a different region of the world, just a hop, skip, and a jump away into the Carolinas, and to create a colony that was really based on Barbados. That colony, and you will find that this is true for both West Africans who came to Barbados, but also West Africans who are from the Carolinas, along with their European cousins and ancestors, is that their names are the same. So you can find the names that are found in Charleston and Wilmington, those famous plantations that we know of that come out of Charleston and Wilmington are also names that you might hear if you ever visit Barbados. Same names, same families, because their second sons and third sons took up land and residency to build out what they thought originally was going to be sugarcane. They realized the environment could not quite do sugarcane. And you might be asking, well, why didn't they go to Florida? Well, Florida was already inhabited. It was inhabited by the Spanish, right? And we know some of the oldest cities. If you've ever been to St. Augustine, raise your hand if you've been to St. Augustine or St. Augustine. Depending on how you say it, people say it different ways. But you will know that St. Augustine is known for its Spanish architecture. And in fact, if you were an enslaved African and could get to in St. Augustine and you were running away, the St. Augustine was a place of sanctuary. St. Augustine would allow you to be free as long as you accepted Catholicism and you would pick up a gun. So enslaved Africans in this part of the country did not just run north, as the story has been told, they also ran south. Yes, okay. But back to Carolinas. Carolinas decided, starting kind of in the Charleston area, but going up and down the eastern seaboard, from all the way down to Jacksonville, all the way up to Wilmington. And Wilmington is the furthest known point because we know which plantation it was in Nevada that held Gullah Geechee folk in captivity. These folk decided to build rice plantations, but they didn't have the knowledge of rice plantations. They didn't know how to build rice plantations. So they went to West Africa and they took folk who were, we might call engineers, irrigationists, and whole villages at night. If there were children between the ages of 7, if there were elderly folk who were younger, who looked like they could make what we might call the Middle Passage, the Great Mayapa, they would be taken from these coastal villages and they would be poured into Barbados first to do what we call seasoning, which is a way of preparing enslaved Africans for their, for what plantation life would be like. And then they were imported and taken into Port Charleston, where we know Charleston operates, having operated that most of 40% of most African Americans in the country, their ancestors came through Port Charleston. Scholars argue that Port Charleston is the Ellis Island of Black communities. When you walk down the streets of Port Charleston, and many of you have, if you've been to Charleston, raise your hand. I like interaction. More than likely, you have walked on brick made by the hands of African children whose fingerprints are still in the brick. When the markets, they now try to erase and they want to call them markets, but we know that they were slave markets. So Charleston becomes a major point, but also other places, Savannah, as you know, Wilmington, but Wilmington is the farthest point north because boats can't get past the rocky area that is North Carolina. And so enslaved Africans were deplaned and departed from those ships into these plantations who already had rice in their veins. And they began to create irrigation systems around those coastal areas that you can see if you're driving through 95, or if you're in the air, or if you are just living in the communities. You might say, well, why does the marshland look like pathways? Well, that was intentional, because the enslaved Africans brought with them a set of knowledges of how to cultivate rice. And the rice they cultivated is something that is a bit of a delicacy in our moments. You probably can't find it in most stores. You cannot go to Piggly Wiggly and get this kind of rice today. It's called heirloom rice. But if you are over in Trader Joe's, if you drive over to Wilmington, or if you come in and go to the fresh market, or to one of your bougie spaces, or if you're on a good farming plantation or a good grain store, they'll call it Carolina Gold rice. Carolina Gold rice is actually the best rice that we know of. In fact, many of you may have grown up eating some of it, Carolina Gold rice, if you're old enough to remember it being in use before you got instant rice. Because Carolina Gold rice is actually what made the Carolinas rich. It actually was the crop that made the Carolinas rich. And so we want to remind you that Carolina Gold rice and these early plantations looked a little bit like this. These plantations were not like cotton plantations where people could live into perpetuity and cultivate families, but be parceled off. These plantations were worker plantations in the same tradition of Caribbean plantations, in the same tradition of South American plantations. These plantations meant that you only had about a 7 to 8 year life expectancy before you died. And so you can imagine the sheer amount of people it took to create these plantations. And how many people created these plantations meant that if you're following Peter Wood's his book, Black Majority, a major scholar in history, you will know that the Carolinas were approximately 60% of African descent at some points in history, mostly in slavery, partially because it took so many people to create what we know as Carolina Gold rice. Now, make no mistake, I have a bag of Carolina Gold rice in my house because I like to use it in things like shrimp and grits and purloo and chicken bog and some of the dishes that some of us grew up in the South. It makes a really good rice pudding if you know about rice pudding. But the work was arduous, not just for both the men, but the work was arduous also for the women. As you can see in the examples, that women were knee deep in water. There was, of course, as you know, there was mosquitoes, there were crocodiles, there were alligators, there were snakes, and any manner of disease could kill them. But one of the things that was unique about both West Africa and the Carolina coast was that many Africans did have some immunity because of the similar living environments, similar tropical conditions of both of those coastal environments. Now imagine, if we can go back, that you're taking whole villages in spaces, even though they look like the Gambia, even though they look like Sierra Leone and the Gold Coast and Benin, those names don't actually really exist for these people. These are Igbo, these are Fulani, these are people with a multitude of names and villages whose kinfolk run up and down those streams that don't necessarily have the nation-state borders that we are accustomed to. And so what you have happening as these multitudes of African Americans, these multitude of Gullah folk, these multitudes of West Africans who are enslaved, living on plantations that are literally almost the same as Auschwitz, living in places that are death. They will never leave this place except by death. Their bodies will never be found because they will be swallowed up into the rivers. These same people who lived on what we now know as plantations, which some people see as luxury, but many scholars see as places of death, these people would come to create a language, a common language that uses both kind of African words, similar words that come down the West African coast, but they will also use the language of their oppressors on these large plantations where they outnumbered their oppressor, sometimes 60 to 1. Now remember, all of our enslavers don't live on the plantations. They own the plantations. They go there to check on their work product, to be there in the harvest season. But where do our oppressors tend to live and spend their daylight? Charleston, Wilmington. They spend it in the cities. And they go back and forth, and particularly on these plantations, these are not cotton plantations, as I remind you, these are rice plantations. So rice plantations meant the division of labor was a little different. As you see African-American men digging things with their hands, as you see women would have been responsible for pounding the rice together. And I will tell you, this is about 20 pounds. So if you ever visit the Georgetown Rice Museum, you will actually be able to hold one of those things. And what we know in history, what our history books tell us, is that people really literally, you've heard the term work themselves up to the bone. The muscle literally fell away from their arms. It atrophied away from their arms when they were making rice. And it is this delicacy, this rice, that becomes a staple, because it becomes a staple for luxury. It becomes a way to fund Europe. It becomes in conversation with Barbados. It becomes a way for crop and industry to make sense in this part of the country. But it also, by product, produces a culture. Now, we've already told you that 40 to 60% of African Americans ancestors came through Port Charleston, which is why it's important to point that out. And I just give you a few pictures of that. But what we also realize is that Gullah does not just create a profitable food crop, it also creates a web of knowing and a language. And the language has form. It has linguistic structure. It is not just ebonics. It's not just something you make up in the sky and throw it and everybody can say it. It is not that. There are structures to the language. And so one word that we see common across patois languages, whether you're talking about West African languages, or whether you're talking about their cousins in the Caribbean or their cousin languages in the US South, is that you see similar structures and similar words come into play. And so our linguistic scholars will tell you that when you start thinking about Gullah isn't just made up words by people who were unable to make up a language of their own. They were trying to create a language that used more than one West African tongue, as well as English. So one word, of course, is una. You say una. Say una again.
Una.
Okay. Try day clean. Day clean. Day clean is literally a word picture, if you will. It means that God has wiped the day clean. It's the start of the new day. So there is even theological ramifications. There is a history of folk tales and lore wrapped into the language. So here are just a few of those words that would have been used. Amen versus woman, una versus you, tita versus sister, in it. Which requires kind of a high diphthong in it. Bukra, which is usually means white. E sits in for he, she, it, his, her. Day clean means dawn. Kuda means turtle. Crack teeth mean talk. Nyam mean to eat. Guan means going. Vegetable means vegetable. And so you see Gullah change. You see this language that we call Gullah come into being through the 400 years of plantation South and oppression that we know existed. But also we get beautiful artifacts. We get the art and the use of the color navy or blue because of the indigo dye that would have also been a profitable crop from West African hands that was important for the culture. But blue also is a color of spirituality in many Gullah Geechee regions. And if you are familiar with like kind of folklore or traditions like roots or traditions like voodoo, then you will know that blue is a signifier to spiritual beings being present. So how do you know? In many plantations or many southern places from here to New Orleans, we know that light blue is used to to paint ceilings before you go into a porch. And what is that color called? Paint blue. It would have been named by your Gullah Geechee folk who would have saw that color and said, this is the color, this shade of blue is to keep the spiritual forces outside, the negative spiritual forces outside of your house. So they wouldn't come in and harm you. It's the same reason you see bottle trees in some yards these days. But what most people know about the Gullah Geechee Coast is not the palmetto flowers, which are a flower that has its roots in the Confederate South, but also is rooted in young teaching people the craft of making sweetgrass baskets. So they would have started with what we call a Carolina rose. But we know most people up and down the Eastern Seaboard, if you've ever been towards Charleston, will have heard about the famous sweetgrass baskets. But sweetgrass baskets were not a $2,000 investment at the time. The sweetgrass baskets, y'all, were the thing that you made so you could flip the rice. So there were these baskets called Fanta baskets. And I don't have an example of a Fanta basket, but you might imagine that the handle of this basket is cut off and you would flip the rice. And in the air, the parts of the rice would go away, and then you would keep the part that is this edible in the basket. And then it would be transferred over to a basket. So when African folk were using this weaving tradition that we see across that uses sweetgrass and palmetto leaves wrapped together to make these really beautiful things, they were not really making art intentionally. What they were making were things to do there. They were making things so they could do the work that they needed to do. So, beautifully so, sweetgrass baskets still emerge as a West African tradition that you can find. Although I will tell you, if you go in IKEA, they sometimes have sweetgrass baskets for $5.99. And do I have some? Yes. Because the ones I have that are from the coast are really small and they cost me $60 a piece. So this tradition is a tradition that is typically passed down from on the women's side of a relationship in a matriarchal sense. But it isn't always women. There is a sweetgrass basket maker out of Charlotte who is from Charleston, who was taught the craft and art by his grandmother, and he continues to practice making sweetgrass baskets. You will also note, I've put some pictures in here that tell you a little bit about kind of contemporary art, and there are lots of artists, but two that I want to bring your attention to. One from this area, this neck of the woods, his name is Ivy Hayes, and most African-American families in this area have an Ivy Hayes painting, including the one who, yep, you too. So we all, Ivy Hayes' pictures are here. And what you should know about Ivy Hayes is that Ivy Hayes, the North Carolina Central graduate, went away to North Carolina Central, was a painter on one hand, had a sickness, and actually had to learn to paint with the other hand. And so the pictures that are most popular are the pictures that are painted with his weakest hand. And they often depict areas of Leland and Brunswick County, very rarely Wilmington, but always blueberries and lots of shades of blue with fish. And jazz and music. And yes, you can find his art still available in the marketplace. And so Ivy Hayes is an important Gullah Geechee community member who was an artist whose work is on our campus and should be in your home. Yes, and we have one piece too at our house. We actually have two pieces because Zach has a piece that was Surfer. The other person is probably a bit more famous. His name is Jonathan Green. And Jonathan Green's work have actually been turned into ballets from South Carolina. He is a Charlestonian. His work can be found in the marketplace. He has had calendars and all kinds of beautiful things. But Jonathan Green's work is synonymous with Gullah Geechee culture. And if you ever want to think about kind of how important Gullah Geechee culture and the aesthetic design is, all you got to look at Ivy Hayes and look at Jonathan Green. And remember this, when you're talking to your grandchildren. It was Jonathan Green's work that is symbolic of what Julie Dash did when she did Daughters of the Dust. And her work is so important that it is Beyonce who took it and used it as the basis of her visual album, Lemonade. That's how deep Gullah Geechee culture is. So most people love the art of the corridor because of its intricacies. Most people recognize that the art looks somewhat Haitian, and it is speaking to Haitian culture because all of it is speaking to West Africa and giving the traditions of our cultural connections. Those are important. But most of us love the food. Most of us, that's how I got to this size. Because I am my grandmama's child, raised in a home where we would have salmon cakes regularly, and I didn't know salmon cakes and grits were not normal breakfast items until I lived in Minnesota. And I was like, why do y'all keep bringing out potatoes? But the reality is that even the way that people catch fish, like even the way that African Americans catch fish even now is related to how they caught fish in West Africa. So this net is actually a handmade net, which you can still find in circulation in parts of the Carolinas. And it would have been used as the way to catch crab and shrimp. Now, you know, I just came visiting from Maryland. They like blue crab. I did, which I was like, okay. And they were like, I was talking to somebody from Maryland. And they were like, well, what kind of crab do they eat on the Gullah Coast? What kind of crab do you think we eat on the Gullah Coast? Blue, actually. Yes, that's how you get she crab soup. So we learned that the Gullah Coast took both I tell people all the time, like, because some of my white students, when they take my class, they go, like, well, you know, Southern food is it's African-American food. It's not really our food. I was like, actually, it is an admixture. The dishes that are made that we eat contemporarily are both West African and European mixing. If this is this is not just one person's genetic code in this food. The food that we make is probably one of the richest ways to tell the story of West Africans meeting Europeans together. Why? Because West Africans would have had to go into the kitchen to prepare some of the food as a way of creating luxury on these plantations. And in the middle of creating food, they would have created a couple of different versions of things. One, things for white folk to eat and things for their families to eat. And there would have been differences. The differences would have been in what can we remember by what we taste. So Europeans might have wanted some different textures to their foods. They might have wanted a pudding, liver pudding. Has anybody had liver pudding? That's good eating. But Africans would have wanted okra. But the way that they would have prepared it for the folk who lived in the big house, they might have called it buckra okra, white okra. Why would they call it white okra, you ask? Well, they called it white okra because buckra was the name for white folk. That was the name that they gave white folk. And that preparation is the way that they would have wanted it. What do you think buckra okra is? Fried okra. That's exactly what it is. We learned that both West African and European hands mix to create a lot of the food traditions that we take for granted. So shrimp and grits, which I make a mean shrimp and grits, but I also continue the pathway of my grandmother's salmon croquettes. And many of these other dishes that include black-eyed peas, bene seeds, which I made bene cookies for my son's class. They thought they were okay. The parents ate the cookies for the most part. We know that bene seeds were similar to a sesame seed, very similar to like that might be used in like sesame chicken. It has a little more flavor. And if you can order bene seeds and make these cookies, but these cookies would have been considered much like the Carolina Rose, a good luck charm for your weddings. So we all like the food. But what else was there? Intellectually, in the 1920s, there were two major scholars, one a Jewish scholar from the Midwest and the other an African-American scholar from the East Coast who actually held debates on whether African-Americans were able to hold on to their retentions. And the argument was that there were two arguments. I'll start with E. Franklin Frazier. E. Franklin Frazier argues that African Americans and slavery was so horrible that African Americans were not able to hold on to their naming practices. They were not able to hold on to their food traditions because of the ways in which slavery was created places of surveillance, and that ultimately much of Black folk in the US lost their cultural idioms. That is the argument that E. Franklin Frazier makes. Melville Herskovitz argues, on the other hand, that African Americans actually retain some of their traditions by hiding them. We call it syncretic in Africana studies. We say that there is syncretism. That means that and we could see this with our food pathways, but we probably can see this in other spaces, particularly naming of children. But we know that African Americans did not necessarily believe in the kind of Christianity that we kind of all assumed that they believe in. What we know is that they hid their West African traditions in things. So language. It wasn't that they couldn't speak English, they just preferred Gullah. Wasn't that they couldn't prepare the rice the way Europeans liked it, it was because they preferred it a different way. And so what we also realize is that in this argument between a white scholar and a Black scholar, is that the white scholar was actually probably right. That there were African Americans intentionally hiding as agents of their own tradition. They're hiding their traditions, their West African traditions they can remember, the West African traditions they were taught, the West African traditions that they grew up on folklore. They were hiding their things inside of other things, in the ways that they could, in what they said to each other, how they spoke in the home versus how they spoke outside of the home. And so these syncretic traditions actually show up in places like graveyards. They show up in places like praise houses, or the ring shout, or passing the baby. Now I'll tell you a little bit about some of these traditions. It is not uncommon in West Africa, in Black communities across the Southeast, and you probably noticed this if you've been in New Orleans, that you will find food and liquor and babies and dolls on people's graves. But I will tell you, like in a contemporary setting, you might actually see people putting things in the casket when they go to funerals. And you might go like, that's kind of a ridiculous, problematic, backwards tradition. Why would they do that? Well, the ancient tradition, the reason that West African folk did this was because they actually believed that you needed these items to get you through the next level of your life, to get you into heaven. And so they wanted to give you food and items that would give you comfort as you move towards the next level in this life, meaning towards heaven. And so many times you will see in traditional West African or traditional Gullah Geechee cemeteries, items that would have been of note of a person as a way of ancestrally venerating them, as a way of saying we love you, we still commit, we still are committed to you, we still care about you. So in this way, you might see this isn't just a Christian practice, this is Christianity meeting kind of West African religious traditions together. And we know that because we know enough about Yoruba, we know enough about West African religious traditions to say some of these practices we know carried over. Secondly, the praise house. From the outside, it looks like a small church. From the inside, it was a place to govern community. Because when you live so far off the woods, y'all know behind God's backside where you live, that sometimes you can't get to a municipality. Sometimes you can't get to a mayor or a governor or whatever. So what happens in the praise house is that the praise house wasn't just a place to pray and it wasn't just a place to sing. It was also a place to think through the issues between two warring families or between two people who have gotten a disagreement. It was a theological understanding that you do no harm to your neighbor. And so the praise house doesn't operate, it operates as a secondary governmenting system in these spaces where you are miles and miles away from anybody who cares about what's going on between you and two other families. The ring shout, as you know, African American. Most people know that when you visit African American churches, African Americans are very African American churches in the main. Now I'm Presbyterian, so you're not gonna see a whole lot of this. But maybe if you visit your Baptist, maybe if you visit your Methodist, maybe, and definitely if you visit your Pentecostal, you will see a lot of volitional kinds of praise, meaning lifting of hands, speaking in tongues, dancing in the aisles. Those things you might be used to in African American traditions if you've been to African American churches. Our churches tend not to be head only where we sit. And what we know is that tradition comes out of West African traditions at this point. And the earliest signs of that tradition was the ring shout, which was a clockwise dance where you did not cross your legs, because if you crossed your legs, it would invoke other spirits. It was intentional to be gendered. So women did the dancing, men did the playing of the instruments. We still have ring shouters in existence today. We, in fact, are thinking about bringing up ring shouters for the next Rice Festival. And so if you've never seen ring shouters, you can find them online, and it is an interesting sight to see. The other tradition that you have is these practices of death and life. And what you see in this picture is a practice that I think for the most part has gone out of tradition, but there was a tradition of passing the youngest child over the casket, because who's most likely to die after an elderly person dies? The youngest. Youngest children are most likely to not have all of the things that they have. We, of course, now have vaccines for everything, of course. But in the earlier day and age, they would have assumed that the youngest and the eldest are tethered together, and that the youngest had to pass over the casket as good tidings for the family in order for them to not be cast, to not have a life lived. And so, again, there are these beautiful, rich traditions of using kind of Christian practices, but hiding West African traditions inside Gullah culture. And you'll see them. We talked a little bit about blues and the blue hag and the hag and the boo hag. And those are just other words for spirits, evil spirits. And that this place that we call that we live in was a place that practiced probably herbal medicine, both by indigenous folk and by African folk. And there's good reason why they did that. Because if you live out way back yonder, how close is the nearest doctor? Right? Yes, way, way over there. And are they to be trusted? Which is the problem that we have right now. So many West African folk brought with them, there were families, in fact, whole families that practiced on what we might call herbal healing practices that are equivalent to some of the things that we see now that are come to pass. And so things like sage and cinnamon and life everlasting, which is another herb, would have been used to keep people alive and to help them make sense, not just of their medicinal journey, but also their spiritual journey. So these are two things in one working together versus the one thing over there and one thing over here. Examples of bottle trees, I saw you hang glue, but all of these things show up not just in spiritual practices, but also in practices around health and wellness. We know that West Africans engineered a particular kind of tradition that we call tabbing, in terms of creating cement, a certain kind of cement that uses mud and seashells. And that would be a preeminent fixture in some parts of our community. So if you see tabbing, more than likely West Africans would have created that because they brought with them tabby when they left West Africa. So there are tabby homes, there are tabby churches, all of those things. The other thing that we know about West Africans at this time was that all West Africans did not practice. There were Christian West Africans who came over from West Africa because the Christianity was already present. But what was more prevalent was Islam. And so Islam, many Islam, or folks who practiced Islam had to hide their tradition, and we know that they were hiding their tradition One of the ways that we know that they hear their tradition is when they were asked to build churches, they always faced east and west. So many churches in the Southeast face east and west. And like there's many burial sites face east and west. One as a marker for homes going back to West Africa, which was a part of the folklore, and there's a long history of that. But also so that the folk practicing Islam could hide the practice of facing the rising sun. And you've heard that before because it's in Lift Every Voice and Sing. All right. That's the end of the show. But what I want to say to you in this moment is that I'm just giving you a snapshot. I'm just giving you a little taste of the kind of cultural idioms that exist right in our own backyards. And I'm giving you a little bit of that taste because it's going to be up to us to continue to preserve these cultural traditions and to preserve these heritages. And I don't know how we do that well, because every space on the coastal community, everybody wants a Hampton Inn, Embassy Suites, and a Hilton. So how do we continue to have people who make sweetgrass baskets if we're forever moving these people off their own land? How do we make sense of the histories of damage done to them by years of not developing these African-American communities that have been here? So much so that children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, they don't live anywhere near the coast anymore. They live in New York, and they live in Minnesota, and they live in the West Coast. How do we remind them that their heritages and histories belong to be kept here, and that the things that they have given us are sacred? How do we keep alive our food traditions when it's so easy to pop in and pop over to McDonald's and pick up some fries rather than to cook a pot of rice after you have had to soak it overnight? How do we teach people to appreciate the land? That is the journey that we are all on together, to help people think about what does it mean to be connected to each other, to have family, to hold on to tradition, to look up and to know that what you have been giving is beautiful and it is not just about slavery. To be reminded that we are all somebody's child and all of us are Benyas, even though some of us have come back. So thank you for your time. I hope you've enjoyed the lecture.
Thank you very much. Any questions right now?
You know, they still make the baskets in Charleston, as you said, okay?
Yeah.
Out of that. And you go down the road, you see them, or go to State Market.
Yeah.
Is the younger generation catching on to that trend, or is it just as the older people, as they pass away, or hands can't handle no more?
Yeah, I think there are challenges. One, I think one of the things that's unique particularly about this part of North Carolina is that we are 20 years ago when let's say, how old am I now? Wait, 25 years ago, let me put a 25. When I was a little younger, we know that most folk were not proud of their traditions. They were not proud to be from these places that had their language in there. And a lot of us who grew up kind of in Gullah or Gullah adjacent communities were taught, like, if you think being Black is bad, Black American is just African American, being in an ethnic enclave that looks like it's backwards is something that you ought to not participate in. So a lot of us, we grew up saying in it, and I grew up saying kuda and stuff like that, but we were taught to kind of walk away from our traditions. And so I think you have younger people doing this, what I might call recovery work. I'm hopeful because you've gotten scholars who are really there are so many books. I brought books on Gullah just to say, there has been an expanse to think about Gullah Geechee culture. And it's not just African Americans, it's actually literally everybody, right? But there is a part of it that is disheartening when I go to, say, Charleston. And I'm looking at, 4 Asian Americans make sweetgrass baskets. Because I know that's not your tradition. I know you're just trying to hustle to get money. And I get it, because I bought my baskets at IKEA. But I do think there is something to be said about the harm that has been done and the recovery work. So I think school systems are doing a better job on the coast of telling the story and teaching about Gullah Geechee culture. But I don't know. It's gonna be different because Charleston's different, right? Most folk who grew up in Charleston do not live in Charleston anymore. They live in Somerville or they live in Moncks Corner. So they don't even like, so these they don't have access to the spaces because everybody wants to live downtown in the beautifully gentrified space. You know that because we know what Wilmington looks like or Savannah. Like everybody wants to be downtown. So what happens to these old Black folk who can't get to the water, right? Who can't get to the land, who the Hilton is in front of the sweetgrass. And so in order to go to get the sweetgrass, they got to go into some land that is now occupied. So those are some of the issues that the corridor is working through right now. Like, I mean, there's one of the reasons why baskets are so expensive is because there's no land where the sweetgrass just goes regularly. You have to have a source to grow it. So, and we know that here, when they migrated here and further out going towards Jacksonville, North Carolina, they use pine needles, but that's not the same. It's just not the same. You'll see pine needles in some sweetgrass baskets. So I hope that answers your question.